Greg has response.
So what?
I don't know, you were talking, keep talking.
Oh. Making a switch from Windows to Arch Linux. I remember it was the last few weeks of when I was going to do my final exams for my... that's good.
A little bit more?
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
And like the last few weeks of my final exam period for the AISC course, Artificial Intelligence Software Development, and Will was showing me around with some Linux stuff. Specifically, I was interested in switching because at the time I was getting into learning Vim and NeoVim specifically, and I was using WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, on my Windows machine. It was a pain because I couldn't do a lot of the things that I would typically be able to do with just a Linux computer, and so that's kind of what pushed me, as well as Will kind of gave me some good tips and stuff. I knew I wasn't going to be able to use the softwares that I typically use. Like for school I was using Microsoft 365, and that was, I don't really like using that, but I had to use it. But then I later realized I can kind of do the same thing with LibreOffice, but just use an older version, a 2005 version of Docs, which worked. And yeah, I just found different ways to work around what I needed on Windows, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I felt like I would need to have Windows on the side, but it's been a really long time since I last booted up to Windows, and I never needed it specifically for any issues I've had. So I like that about Arch. After the massive learning curve, since I wasn't very tech savvy in Linux, I did have some experience with Ubuntu and some Mint. I learned a lot more about the CLI. I learned a lot about how the packages and stuff work. And it was great. I used it for lazy Vim. I've been doing my work on that. Even though I was terrible at using terrible at knowing how Vim works, it was still fun. Wasting like what could have been done in like an hour, spread out to be like 4 or 5 hours. just having fun learning the new things. And yeah, I'd say I'm pretty proficient in it now. I can do a lot of the stuff that I'm about the same level as I was just using VS Code on its own, but it's just more fun because I feel like I'm more in control and learning new things every day. Like Will taught me some cool stuff, like grouping a bunch of the lines and then using it to, was it the norm?
Yeah, the norm command. I learned that from what's his face. If you guys like Linux content and like Vim content specifically, what's his name? Sylvan Franklin. SYLVAN FRANKILIN. Anyway, yeah, the norm command is pretty cool. It allows you to select a visual selection in Vim and run a normal command on all of those lines. It's called the norm command if you want to look it up. I did want to say something about, you think it's done?
Yeah. Okay. You could just turn it off and leave it in there for a bit.
Okay. I did want to say something about switching to Linux from Windows and how often I needed to use Windows, and I found that, like, over time, I would go months without using Windows, but I'd eventually run into a problem with my peripherals, like my mouse or my AIO, for example, like my cooler for my computer. And I would need a Windows software to fix something, to maybe like reflash it or fix some of the settings. And so I always have a Windows installation just for that, but now that I've been using Linux for so long, I will like make it my priority when I'm buying new products to make sure I don't need a Windows system in order to, or like even a Mac system to change my my settings for that piece of hardware. And had I known about like that sort of compatibility, that set of compatibility issues with things like mice, and other things, I wouldn't have bought them in the first place. So yeah, that's something I definitely learned to keep track of, or keep in the back of my mind. For you, the person who wants to switch their main PC, I assume that you have a lot of experience with Linux already, seeing as you use it for your server and your laptops. I guess you can leave it like a comment if you watch this, and I want to know if you have that experience and you still use Windows on your main PC, what's the purpose of switching if Windows works for you? Do you feel like you're going to get more out of using a Linux system for your main PC, or is it just like you feel the need to switch to Linux? Because I used to be of the mindset, or I still kind of am, but I used to be of the mindset that everything needs to be Linux, but using proprietary software sometimes is, justified. If you have other things going on in your life, you don't really need open source everything all the time. If it works for you, it works for you. Anyway. And one thing that you said that I wanted to relate to was switching to Linux, and the time that I did it. I switched to Linux in probably the worst possible time ever, which was in the middle of exam week, like my second year of university. Now, the saying that kept going through my mind was, there will never be a perfect time in order to start things. And that saying has sort of stuck with me for a lot of my life, but I find myself using that saying to justify doing things that I am doing to procrastinate on other things. So like I was doing Linux stuff instead of studying, and I used the phrase as my excuse for doing the thing. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. You have anything else to add to this video?
Yeah, just going back on the thing with some hardware is requiring Windows software. I found out that I'm able to control a lot of my... The reason why I wanted to keep using Windows was because a lot of my peripherals required software, like Synapse or IQ, which is a software for controlling my RGB, as well as controlling as well as the Adrenaline software for AMD. So those things are just used to control my hardware, like color-wise, or like for the Adrenaline specifically, so I can what's that called? Overdrive, or like make my GPU, put more power into my GPU, put less power, things like that. And I found out that I'm able to control a lot of, well, not everything, but most of it using a virtual machine if I allow a lot of the permissions through. And I was able to configure a lot of lights and configure my mouse and configure... I wasn't able to configure my GPU because that was very... I prefer just using the softwares from Linux either way. But my mouse and have RGB on my PC, that stuff was very difficult to kind of configure. I was able to do it though, but I wasn't able to configure the RAM sticks because that was built for the motherboard. There was no specific USB connection to it, unlike the fans and other sort of things, the AIO and stuff. And yeah, so a workaround was using a virtual machine. Specifically, I use VirtualBox. I haven't tried VMware. Maybe it could work better or worse. But yeah, that's my input.
I hope we answered your comment. Let me get your name. Hold on. yuki-dt8om. How do you pronounce that? Is there a preferred thing that you want to me to call you by? Yeah. All right. Goodbye. Take care.